an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Yeah, I think it's disgraceful. You're trying to indoctrinate our kids. They should be in the classroom learning about reading, writing, spelling, arithmetic, the whole shebang. That's why today I'm announcing that our government is exploring the feasibility of a tunnel under the Highway 401. If you're healthy, get off your A.S.S. and start working like everyone else is. We're an open book.
Well, here we go. We are an open book, and we're back in business here on the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. For those of you who are faithful listeners on Apple or Spotify, we're also on the YouTube this week, and we're going to try and continue this. Apparently, I'm told we got to be where your audience is, and some of you are here. So welcome in, and away we go. And it's kind of exciting because it's been a long summer off, and the summer off continues at Queen's Park in terms of the recess. It'll be another few weeks at least before they're back in the legislature. But we thought we should kind of kick-start things again here, and let's get back into business. So here we go. As we recorded this, it's the 26th day of September, and glad to welcome in the usual suspects. Keith Leslie is here. Of course, he's a Queen's Park commentator and a longtime friend of the show and co-host. John Wright is one of the co-founders, of course, on the program. We started all this sort of on the back of a napkin. We'll get to that. And the campaign back in 2018 when Kathleen Wynne was the premier of this province, 25th premier. And we're also pleased to welcome in Tim Hudak. He's the former P.C. Ontario leader. This is good to have all of you. So it's kind of a fun time to be here. Certainly Kathleen and Tim, I don't know if it's kind of like when I pitch a client and all of a sudden they say yes right away, and I think, shit, I didn't ask for enough money. So I don't know. Both of you said yes so quickly. I thought, wow, what did I do wrong? But listen, I'm glad you're here. Thanks for being here. This is going to be kind of fun. And one thing, Kathleen Wynne, when we sent out the note yesterday, what do you want to talk about? The only error that you made is when you said, I want to talk about this, this, and this, and anything you guys agree on. I just want to make it clear that this is not a place for agreement. This is really the point of having the conversations, and away we go. Just for both of you, certainly Kathleen and Tim, typically when the House is in recess, it's sort of a quiet time. This was just give me your 10 cents of what you thought the summer was like, Tim. It was kind of crazy, certainly for the government. The by-election that was called, we didn't see coming. We saw the Minister of Education come and go in a flash. What do you think? Lots of talk about an early election.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, you're right. August tends to be a sleepier time, but then events get in the way. And certainly, Todd Smith, he did a hell of a job as Minister of Energy. Just couldn't do education and had a really good gig on the side. I think it would be really challenging for him to take on that portfolio. His wife is a principal, as you know, and he had really good prospects in the private sector. I do believe, though, Dave, that Premier Ford is seriously thinking about doing an election in 2025. And as Premier Wynne knows, and of course, Keith and John, veterans of politics, you set the stage for that. You start rolling out your plan. You start framing the kind of ballot question you want to have. And if I had to guess by some of the announcements through summer in September, a big part of that will be a continuation that Doug gets it done, that he's going to have an infrastructure plan that will, I think, put the other parties all on the opposite side.
Well, Kathleen Wynne, I just was looking at the social media, and we'll get into some of the sort of the pre-campaign campaign. But to Tim's point, boy, I have never seen the Premier's office so active on all of the platforms, particularly on platforms like LinkedIn, where he was, when he's out there, he's talking about the economy, he's talking about the local issues, and it's not the headline stuff. So to me, that was the real hint that we're really ramping things up, getting ready for a campaign.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple of things going on, Dave. I think that the need to distract from some things, like the possible release of a report on the Greenbelt issue. I think the premier really doesn't want to have to deal with that without having won another mandate. So I think he's trying to get busy and distract from that. And I think the other thing is that the threat of a federal election and Pierre Poilievre being the prime minister. I mean, there's been all sorts of talk about how they don't get along, and it's not good for Ford to be running if Poilievre is the prime minister already. So it does feel to me like they're in campaign mode for sure. Because honestly, there hasn't been a whole lot of policy that this government has put forward in terms of vision for the province. And now, as it looks like we're in the run up to an election, there are all these announcements that are coming that make it feel like they have a plan. We can argue whether it is actually a plan or not. But the other thing that it's doing, Dave, is it's normalizing this notion of having an election a year earlier than he needs to. And I think at some point he's going to have to answer the question, why are you doing this? Why are you going into an election when you have another whole year that you could be governing with a majority parliament? So I think it's going to be an interesting session when they come back on October 21st. I think that's the date.
Well, let's go to the pollster, John. I think your mic is muted. There you go. Does it matter? Are we actually talking about things that really matter around the kitchen table? Because that's kind of the pulse that you're taking. We keep seeing the poll after poll. Approval ratings are high. It doesn't seem to matter what happens. They're poised for another majority.
Yeah, and I think the former premier indicated it was, he's going to have to answer at some point to this. What I find fascinating is that it's all very urban based. I mean, my wife comes from Eganville, which is in the Ottawa Valley, and certainly, talking about a tunnel is really not something for her, and bike lanes as well. So, I mean, the people in Pembroke and Ottawa Valley are not listening to this sort of stuff. So it's very urban based. The poll that I've just finished doing and released yesterday takes the sounding of 4 cities, Toronto, Calgary, Edmonton, and Vancouver, very in-depth polling for City News. And what it shows is the premier holding 30% of the vote here in Toronto, which is almost where he was when he got it. So the question in my mind is whether he's making the play for more seats in Toronto, because this is very, very Toronto-based, very centric. And he may be seeing something that, is beyond what I'm looking at. But clearly there's a purpose to this, however fanciful or, it appears to be, there's a purpose to it. And it's got more issue traction in Toronto than it does anywhere else.
Yeah, Keith, it's funny how we typically quiet summer, as Tim points out, normally when recess, whether it's federal or provincial, the ripples in the water in Ontario were affected significantly by the federal by-elections. So there's a lot of soil that's been turned over here, and we're not quite sure what we're going to grow now as we head into the fall.
Well, even the provincial by-election, one that was called virtually, the day after Todd Smith resigned in Belleville, Bay of Quinte, the Conservatives held the riding, but the Liberals, got to be very encouraging for them, came a much closer second than they ever have before in that riding. And so the Liberals, even though they're still in the political wilderness without official party status, coming in second there was a big deal for them. And the NDP coming in third was an even more ominous warning for Merritt Stiles and the New Democrats. So the Ford, as John mentioned, Ford's in a pretty strong position still overall. I agree with Kathleen. These announcements about the tunneling under the 401 and the bike lanes, these are distractions. It's the same as all this election speculation. He had this the media speculating about an election this fall. I mean, it's just the opposition parties are trying to nominate candidates and get up to speed. He doesn't want to be talking about the fact that emergency departments are overcrowded and people are being treated in ambulance bays. Other emergency departments are being shut down. The homeless encampments have spread all over the province, small towns, big cities, everywhere. And all these other issues that this government clearly does not want to deal with, including that Greenbelt report that's coming from the RCMP, hopefully at some point. So the Ford government's in a strong position right now, and that's why I think we're going to see that early election next spring, unless, of course, Poilievre goes out first, manages to bring down the Trudeau government first, then everything's up in the air. But again, to Kathleen's point, Ford has yet to explain why he needs to go to an election in 2025 when there's one scheduled in 2026, and he's in the middle of a second majority government.
All right, well, let's get to the news of the day. This happened yesterday, and it kind of caught folks a little bit, I would say, a little
That's
off guard.
why today I'm announcing that our government is exploring the feasibility of a tunnel under the Highway 401. This tunnel would serve as a new expressway for both cars in transit, from Brampton and Mississauga in the west to Markham and Scarborough in the east, connecting with major roads and highways along the way. This tunnel and expressway will cut gridlock, support economic growth, and help get people moving faster.
I love the backdrop there. Just all that crazy traffic in the background made all the sense in the world. And of course, once the premier finished his comments, went to the media, and the first question, pretty obvious.
Hi, Premier. Jessica from the Trillium. I want to know if you're going to be upfront with people about the potential costs of this so they have a chance to know that information before the next election.
And why wouldn't I be up front? And we're doing a feasibility study. So the feasibility study will come in and we'll be transparent. But I'll tell you one thing, we're getting this tunnel built.
Okay, I ask why you wouldn't be because you haven't been with the 413 and other projects. If you're going to be upfront with that, will you tell us right now what the projected cost for the 413 project is going to be?
Well, again, as we're moving forward and we're building the 413, we've been pretty transparent on cost, and I'll get the exact number for you. But we're an open book.
We're an open book. Well, we'll wait to see on that. But I think, the question is obvious. We're kind of down the road now, Kathleen, in terms of what we're looking at vis-a-vis costs and price and feasibility and everything else. This is, good God, I heard this morning that maybe an alternative would be to bury the gardener. So you talk about distractions. This is where we're going on all of this. But the fact of the matter is, just doing the feasibility study doesn't mean we're ever going to do this. So, is this a master class in distraction, or is it just kind of one of those hopeful things that we can wave in front of folks and say, look, we're getting it done?
Yeah, I do think it's a bright, shiny object. It's obviously got people talking. And to John's point, I actually think, John, this is a suburban play because downtown people, they're not happy with bike lanes being ripped up and being banned. They're not happy with more highways being built. They want a different kind of active transportation option, more transit and so on. So I think this is a suburban play. It was interesting, Dave. The traffic was the backdrop, but the traffic was moving. The traffic was moving quite well along the highway. So I think that this is a very unrealistic suggestion. Having been the Minister of Transportation, there's no shortage of bright ideas that can come out of the ministry. And interestingly, this premier canceled a plan that had a feasibility study done that did have a business case for high-speed rail to Waterloo. And that would have changed the dynamic, the relationship in the greater Toronto area as well. So I don't believe for a minute that this is going to happen. I think that it's a cracked scheme. I think there's lots that could be done on the 407. If the government really feels that they have the cash to do this, which is, $120 billion, who knows? I mean, you're saying we're down the road in terms of the details and so on. It's just the beginning of the conversation. And I think that, subsidizing trucks on the 407, that might be a much better way of alleviating congestion. So I think it's a bright, shiny object. And I think that it's, I don't believe that people will put up with that kind of disruption for a road that's just going to draw more cars.
Well, Tim, the issue here, though, is congestion. And I think here's the problem I have with this entire discussion is that we look at it like, well, this is a dumb fucking idea. We're never going to get it done. That will be the commentary and the discussion. We're not going to get at the issue of congestion in the GTA and in downtown Toronto and all of these things. We're losing sight of that.
I am in the total opposite other ledge from you folks on this issue. Deb Hutton, my wife, the News Talk 1010 afternoon host, sent this to me when it broke, and I literally leapt out of my seat. So I'd love to talk on the wonk side, why I think it is time for big bets in transportation. But I want to come back to politics a little bit, because I think you guys are way off on distraction. This is not a distraction. This is actually classic Ford. In his most natural environment, he's probably wearing a construction hat. It really is the 413 debate writ large, right? Where he was on one side of an issue to build a new highway, which is needed. But on the politics side, that really helps swing votes in the Western GTA all the way through York region. This is the next big thing that will hit on what's on the minds of a lot of people in that voter universe in the GTA around actually saving time, getting home earlier, the need to actually do something big on infrastructure. This is clearly, I think, going to be a major plank of where Ford wants to go, and it nicely differentiates the PC party from the rest. Not a distraction. This is a big thing, and he's sincere about it.
But then why aren't we talking about the idea of using or better using the 407? And to all due respect to the Premier, it is not at near capacity. I use it 4 times a month, and it's wide open. And people are bombing along there at 135 clicks, and there's nobody in their way.
Yeah, so I'll put the wonk hat on a little bit too. My second point on why it's not a distraction is, I mean, Premier Ford, you are where you come from in politics, right? And so as a Toronto guy, I got very close to being mayor. Anything around Toronto, which I think explains the bike lanes issue and not taking out more roadways, really runs through, his roots and how he thinks. With respect to the policy side, I think you should look at the whole gamut. One of the things I had talked about when I was PC leader was uploading the Gardiner and uploading the Don Valley Parkway. Keith, remember this? There was one time a proposal came forward to Premier Harris and then went to Mel Lastman, then City of Toronto Mayor, to actually double deck the Don Valley. It was one of those big bets. The mayor didn't want to do it, so it faded into the background. I think you should look at the gamut. I don't know if the statute of limitations has expired on the Allen and actually burying that and taking it down towards the Gardiner. I think there is a strong case to be made to examine whether the Gardiner should go underground like Boston did, which now looks beautiful on the top. Gives you plenty of capacity to build homes people can actually afford and save commuters time. I think you should, the 407 idea, look at them all across the board, see how they weigh. But I do believe, just like we saw decades ago with Leslie Frost, it's time for a big bet on transportation infrastructure to include subways, rail, and burying some of our highways.
Well, I know congestion and Antigonish is a real problem for you, Keith, but and what we have in Toronto doesn't compare. But it just, when you watch all of this kind of play out, that is this a problem too big to get our arms around?
Not really. I mean, something has to be done. Congestion is clearly an issue. These particular projects, though, especially about tunneling under, burying the Gardiner and tunneling under the 401. I was in Toronto this summer when the heavy rains hit, a month's worth in a couple hours. There were waves lapping up against cars on the Lakeshore Boulevard. The 401, the day of the King's Stake, is it? The big race? They had to cancel the race. There was flooding everywhere. All the 401 ramps were flooded. How are we going to be tunneling up there? And we don't have enough drainage right now to handle this situation. I think this, to Tim's point, I think Ford is looking, for legacy ideas and for big projects. He does want to think big, and he does want to look at the billions of dollars. But there's so many other things that the government needs to put a priority on, and it's just not. And so many social issues it just ignores completely to go after these big things. And I know Ford, he complained when he was in Windsor making an announcement the other day. He didn't complain. He actually praised the Windsor reporters because they all stayed on topic. He said, it never happens at the Queen's Park Press Gallery. They always go off topic. But when he did the tunnel under the 401 announcement yesterday, every question was on topic, but there were no answers, particularly the cost. I mean, even in the feasibility, well, we're doing a feasibility study, but we're going to get this done regardless of what the feasibility study says, is basically what he's doing. So we don't even have a cost on the feasibility study. We still have no cost on the 413. We have no idea of the details or the cost of the 95-year lease for Therme on the Toronto waterfront at the Ontario Place site. So this open book Premier has really got to start opening the books if he wants to get people on side with a lot of these things. Otherwise, it just comes back to that same opposition criticism that he's looking out for the big developers and the big people and not really caring so much about the little guy, while speaking a lot about, going to help commuters. But even the 413, the studies that show what's it going to save, 3 to 6 minutes on an average commute is just not necessary. I know it's not part of the war on cars, so he wants to position himself on the other side of the war on cars that he sees coming from Toronto, and it might help him with some Toronto and 905 votes. But I think he's on the wrong side of this.
Yeah, I was watching MSNBC last night, John, and they were talking about obviously the presidential campaign, but they brought up FDR in 1932, and the phrase that he used was bold, persistent experimentation, and out of that, among other things, came the creation of Social Security in the United States, the big ideas, and the premise being, if you don't, swing for the fences, you're never really going to get anywhere. And we kind of feel like, especially coming out of the pandemic, you've talked about the reckoning, in the last 2 or 3 years that we're going to have to face. It seems to me that we're at a place where we need to swing for the fences. So to Tim's point, I give the Premier credit for, batter up.
Well, I'm more to Tim's side. I was just talking about the polling because it's maybe 30% in Toronto, but it is 40% province-wide. So he's pretty well got what he had when he came to the premiership first round. I think the thing I've said on this podcast before, and I stay at it, is that oftentimes what the premier does is practice retail politics. And that may simply be because he's coming from a municipal background and he wants to kind of do it a case at a time. But if you step back a fair bit and you see a series of different things that are coming to mind, and that is the 413, the uploading of the Gardner, a tunnel being bored. Nowadays, you can do almost a mile every week. With bike lanes, there is the semblance of something that's a plan more than a concept going on here. It happens to ride on the backs of what is the third or fourth biggest issue in the Toronto area, which is traffic congestion. So he's hitting those notes. But I always find this premier announces things without it being part of a bigger piece. And you have to look higher up and back to get a sense of, well, he may have a plan, but we just don't see it. I do think this is a retail politics. That's not to say it's a bad thing. It worked with beer and wine in the corner stores. But there's something else that's bigger here. And I wonder whether or not they're ever going to take it out of the box and show us the big plan.
When we start to look at how this is playing out, it'll be interesting to see how this gets stick handled, because to the point of it being a distraction, so to speak, the immediate out of the box was, we're kind of getting a head shake, and this is like from Matt Gurney over at TVO was commenting on it. But I giggled last night. We all know Scott Reed, and his tweet was, if we can build a tunnel under the 401, surely we can dig a little deeper and add a spa and a Ferris wheel down there. So there's going to be that level of discussion, I think, as we kind of move it forward. But a lot of this, to John's point around retail politics, is really interesting. And I think that's where we go with the school board story, because this morning, as we record, the report out of the Toronto District School Board is that they're not going to have any more field trips, because it ended up that some kids in Toronto ended up at a protest, and that was problematic for a lot of reasons. The premier was asked about that earlier this week.
Yeah, I think it's disgraceful. You're trying to indoctrinate our kids. They should be in the classroom learning about reading, writing, spelling, arithmetic, the whole shebang. But instead, the TDSB and these teachers want to bring them down to a rally, a Palestinian rally, and it's ridiculous. Stick with your knitting. Stick with teaching the kids the geography, history, math, spelling. That's what they need. They don't need to be indoctrinated in some protest. It's unacceptable. There needs to be an investigation, and we'll be all over this.
And that investigation is underway, but it has sparked a lot of calls, Tim, for, we listen, the best before date is well past on school boards. Let's just deal with this at a provincial level, because we tend to have too many of these localized issues. The money we spend, there's all kinds of arguments. And this sort of situation only adds fuel to that fire.
It just seems like it's different characters, but same plot over and over again when it comes to school boards, focusing on the wrong issues. I remember during my time in government, the greatest growth area in education spending was not teachers in the classroom or special needs kids or any kind of technological support, Dave. It was actually the growth of school board bureaucrats. I think the time has come to actually test out whether we still need this structure. It's an anachronism. It is the worst form of government. doesn't really do much anymore. Reforms from the P.C. government through the McGuinty government, strip powers away from the school boards. And so as a result, they're getting into this kind of mischief and wrong type of decision that I believe is at odds where most parents are for their kids. And I suspect a lot of classroom teachers as well. I would love to see this. Manitoba did this not too long ago. Under the Pollster government, they examined getting rid of school boards, having the province and principals take greater authority. It will take a lot of energy to do. It will need to be a focus if you go down that path of a government. And I remember this was actually brought before Premier Harris as well at the time. The view then was there was just so much change taking place. That was one step too far. I think it's come time to actually take a serious look whether we actually need to waste our money in these school boards or get more money into the classroom.
Kathleen Wynne.
School board trustee.
Red flag. So I think I'm the only person on this panel who's been a school trustee. Is that true? I don't think anybody else has been a school trustee yet. So I will just say that, under the Harris government, and Tim, I always say to young people, Mike Harris made me. I would never have been in provincial politics if it hadn't been for Mike Harris, because he did all the things you said. He debilitated school boards. He took money out of education, all of those things that made a provincial activist out of me. So here's the thing. It has been done in other provinces, as you say. I think it was Nova Scotia. Keith, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Nova Scotia got rid of school boards and then over time had to reintroduce bodies locally to do the work that school boards were doing. School boards are the oldest form of elected government in the country. There were school boards before there were city councils. There were school boards before there was a provincial government, because people moved into communities. They wanted a school for their kids, and parents and community members became those board members. And my grandmother taught in Northern Ontario when there would be a board for one school, right? And over years, school boards have been amalgamated. Obviously, under the Harris government, a lot of them were amalgamated and the funding authority was taken away from them. But the point I want to make is that there's a lot of work that goes into facilitating the navigation of education for parents and community members, understanding policy that comes from the ministry, implementing it, and holding someone accountable for making that policy work. If the school board doesn't exist, then that's going to land on the plate of every MPP at Queen's Park. And I can tell you, Tim, that would be a very onerous burden for an MPP to carry. So I really believe that this was a mistake. This was something that should not have happened. I can't imagine why a field trip to any kind of protest, and it wasn't to a pro-Palestinian protest, as the Premier said. It was actually supposed to be to Grassy Narrows, a protest on Grassy Narrows, which is the community that has suffered from mercury poisoning since the 60s. And there was supposed to be an education component on the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. That's not what happened. It became something else. But even if it had been that, why would kids be going to a protest as a field trip? So obviously that was a mistake. That doesn't mean that the 72 school boards in Ontario that govern the nearly 5,000 publicly funded schools are a bad thing. So I think we have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's an ideological component to this. We always knew, Tim, that there were people in your cabinet and in your back room when you guys were in government that you wanted to get rid of school boards. That looked like that's the path you were going down. I'm sure some of those same people are whispering in Doug Ford's ear. But I think there's an element for people at Queen's Park. Be careful what you wish for. 5,000 schools is a lot of responsibility, and the minutia of what school board trustees get involved with, I'm not sure that elected provincial officials have the capacity or want to do that.
But I'll ask the two former MPPs then on this, to your point, Kathleen, and that is to say, I have to think that based on the way people consume their information, their understanding of government, their relationship with the school and with the province, the MPP was probably going to get the phone call about bitching about what's going on at the school board before the trustee got that call.
No, that's not my experience. When people would come to my office with an education issue, it was because they couldn't get their trustee to do a thing. But that didn't happen very often, because if you have a trustee who's actually doing her job, and I say her job because there are a lot of women who are trustees across the province. If you have a trustee who's doing the job, then that trustee is actually helping that family. So that was obviously I had people talk to me about education issues, but it was more education issues at the provincial level because I had been the minister. But the minutia of the special ed programs, because each board has authority over the configuration, for example, of special ed classes. They have authority over staffing decisions and staffing models, and those things can be dealt with at the local level, and the trustee is accountable for those, where an MPP would have to do a whole lot of digging to actually have access to that kind of information.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the granular nature of it, but it just seems, Keith, that we stumble over the arcane nature of each local issue being dealt with locally, but at the same time, all the funding and standards are set at Queen's Park. So there will always, forever, be a clash. That we're never going to kind of get to a point where everybody likes the idea of the school board.
No, we're not. And I think this debate is going to continue. And if another Conservative government wants to try and tackle this on and shut them down, they can, I think, as Kathleen says, take a close look at the minutiae we'll end up having to deal with. I want to go a little bit further. But first of all, I want to note that Kathleen didn't jump on Ford saying stick to your knitting, which was, I mean, let's face it, teaching profession is overwhelmingly women. But I want to go actually back. I take a slightly different view, or very different, it seems. This protest was supposed to be, and a rally was supposed to be about grassy narrows. And if it's the First Nations in Canada that's been more screwed over, I don't know about it. These, as Kathleen said, from the 60s, and it's still going on. The mercury contamination, this crap is still flowing down the river. They're still being poisoned. And we don't teach this in schools. So I think there's, at a certain level, like we want to ban all field trips. No, I think high school kids should be brought to a demonstration like this. No, not one that turns into a Palestinian and Hamas demonstration. That's not what this was supposed to be about. And apparently they were having the kids chant. That's completely wrong. I don't agree with that at all. But how are kids, especially high school kids, how are they going to learn about the issues of today, which aren't being taught in their class? And this is an issue that's been going on for decades. If there's any group that needs support, and needs support from the big city, from the people down in the core, where they've got support up north, but there's no one there to do anything realistically about it. This group, Grassy Narrows, needs so much support, and people need to learn about what's going on there. This is, as I say, been going on for decades, and people are completely unaware of the poisoning, the mercury poisoning that's gone on in that community for generations. So I think there's something to be said for bringing high school students to a demonstration like that. Carefully, again, chaperoned, and if there's any sign of anything getting in a hand, that the teachers can just quickly remove them from the scene. That's not always perhaps practical, but I think kids should be allowed to see what protests are and decide whether there should be something that's being protested. Governments aren't always correct. And if we ban them from, even participating in or seeing a protest, they're never going to know they have this right to actually get out and engage and disagree with their government.
Yeah, most of those First Nations, John, I've heard them referred to as just flyover zones for the most part. We've talked about the suburban and the urban issues in Ontario and across this country. But boy, when you start talking about Indigenous and First Nations communities, they suffer because of willful ignorance in many respects. So to Keith's point, yes, we probably should be paying more attention to that. We're coming up to the National Day of Reconciliation at the end of the month. This could have been a good thing.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've got two kids who have gone through the school system and just graduated. The last one just graduated from university. So I haven't got a stake in it, except the personal experience that if my kids had been taken to any protest, I would have asked what the heck is going on here. I mean, you can sit in a classroom, you can have field trips to other things, but going to a protest, unless you're trying to learn the tactical elements of civics and how you participate in society through peaceful or agitated protest, I don't know why they're there. The second thing is to go back a little bit to this, and I don't get involved in politics very much because I'm supposed to be kind of neutral in all of this. But in 1990, I was living in East York, and Dave Johnson was the mayor of East York at the time. And I remember standing in July of that year and hearing at the Canada Day celebration that the East York trustees had increased their salaries behind closed doors of 37%. And I went home and started an entire campaign, which in fact ended up with the trustees reversing engines just about a year later on the decision that they'd made. I mean, we packed schools and civic centers. It was called Stop Trustees Overpayment Stop. And it was on all the different stop signs around the area. And what I find about all of this is the unaccountability of school boards. What I find about this is that the school boards are continually making decisions which fly in the face of what Dave Johnson at the time called and took this out as a notion, was common sense. Like, what are you doing and why are you doing that? So when I look at the numbers and I see 2/3 of the people across this province saying that they have no time for a school board. And yes, you can get into, well, they do this and they do that. The thing is that the school boards have created a sense that, if you ask people today in Toronto, well, what are they good for? I'm not sure they'd actually be able to articulate it the same way that a former trustee is able to do so. As a parent, I don't know what they do. As somebody who is a civic observer, I think they spend a lot of money and maybe unaccountable. But the other thing is they oftentimes get involved in issues which bring a taint to whatever they're supposed to be doing. And that's why we have 2/3 of the public not only saying that they shouldn't be there, but also the majority saying that the province should do something about it. So it's fertile ground to be plowed.
And Dave, can I just answer Premier Wynne's question as well? And look, she was an exceptional talent, a great trustee, rose to be Premier of the province of Ontario. And Kathleen, you're the exception that defines the rule, because I have found in my experience that the trustees are often AWOL. Another exception, Marie Rizzo, she's been helpful. I should say that. I'm the chair of Parent Council, Loretto Abbey in North Toronto. She's really helped us get capital money for the school. But honest to goodness, my 21 years in politics, you'd be better off spotting a ghost than seeing the trustee. The voter turnout for trustee is probably barely above levels of folks who believe that Elvis is still alive. There is a lack of accountability. And I think it's just time to look at this fading, barnacle-covered institution and try to find something better. Sadly, I do know this was brought before Premier Ford. He understands how many calories this would eat up on your political agenda. So it got a pass. But I hope one day the wall came down. We found out who Deep Throat was. I want to see this taken on.
Okay, Dave, I just have to say one thing. So two things. First of all, this is a little bit, Tim, when you said the thing about Maria Rizzo, this conversation's a little bit like the research. And John, you can tell me if this research is still relevant. But when I was a trustee and then when I was minister, when you looked at people's opinions of the education system, they would say the education system is in disarray, it's a mess, but my school is really good. And so, Tim, what you just said there is all trustees are, they really don't function well, they're not accountable, but my trustee actually helped us. So, ask the parents of special needs kids, ask the parents of a school that needs a new boiler, whatever the issue is. If the trustee is doing their job, and I wasn't the only trustee in the province who did their job, there are lots of trustees across the province who do, then, you'll find people who are being helped. So I just think we have to be really careful. And under the Mike Harris government, what you were talking about, John, could never happen. Trustees went down to $5,000 a year. When I was a trustee, I earned $5,000 a year as a trustee. We raised that a little bit when we were in government, but still, you don't work as a trustee and make a living. That's not what it's about. It's largely a volunteer position. And, as I said, be careful what you wish for.
But my supplemental, Mr. Speaker, on this, I've worked with a ton of trustees, right? 21 years there in across Niagara, and I can name two that I would actually vote for. I'd vote for Kathleen and that, and I'd vote for Maria and that's it. I would have much more faith in empowering the principal, empowering parents, and having the MPP take some responsibility. They're far more active than the general class of trustees.
We've got about 10 minutes here, so I do want to get to the comments about the encampments. But Keith, you brought up the point earlier this month, the constitutional challenge to Bill 7, and we've talked a lot about this in terms of what folks who are in long-term care, or rather being moved to long-term care, beyond their consent. That is to say, outside of their city, and if they don't move, they're being fined. I'm not sure where this is going to go. Not to be glib, but a lot of the folks who are sort of subject to this will effectively, let's use the phrase, age out of this by the time it actually goes through the courts. So I understand the symbolic nature of taking it to court, but at the same time, boy, this is a problem or an issue that needs to be resolved now. And I don't know what you do about the bottleneck, because it's real. The bottleneck is real in the hospitals. So we have to deal with that. But at the same time, I'm not sure that fining people or pushing them into homes that aren't suitable for them at that stage of their lives is the right thing to do.
Well, the current cohort may age out, as you put it, but there's going to be more and more and more. This problem is going to increase. The Premier said, how can anyone be so heartless as to drop their parents off at the hospital and not take them back home? Well, when my mom was going through the early stages of Alzheimer's, when we were able to care for her, and then when it reached a level where we couldn't care for her anymore, and we didn't know what to do, and the Alzheimer's Society told us, well, when you're having a really bad episode, call an ambulance, they'll take her to the hospital, and then you refuse to take her home. That's how it happens. That's how you end up as an alternative level of care patient in a hospital bed when you really need to be somewhere else. Often they will get treated, they need a little bit of treatment for whatever they're going through at that time, whatever episode is. But then they end up staying 6, 8 months, maybe longer. That's a real problem for hospitals. It backs the system up right up to the emergency department. But this law, where we're fining them up to $400 a day, right now seniors have a choice of 3 nursing homes or long-term care centers that they can list for. Right now, if you don't get your first choice, you wait and get to the second. This is none of your choices. This could be to a community outside where you are, more than 100, 200 kilometers away. Now, all of a sudden, people, even in nursing homes, people need family support. The more family support, the better their experience in nursing homes. The further away you are from your family, the less family support you're going to get. And every nursing home worker and personal support worker and nurse in those homes will tell you the families provide a huge amount of care, and without them, they'd be even worse situations. So finding people is not the answer. There needs to be more beds. Obviously, we need to have more nurses. We need all of this. The whole system is crunched. But finding people when they're put in this situation and then trying to put them into a home that's literally too far for their family to visit them on a daily or weekly basis, it's inhumane. And we need to have more hospital beds. We need to have more nurses. I mean, there's all these things we've tried to have. There was one report today, depending on what province you're in, between 25 and 45% of nurses quit the profession by the age of 35. There's an issue there that needs to be addressed. All of this needs to come together. It's obviously all in one healthcare system. But this is just tragic. And forcing people into homes or finding them tens of thousands of dollars is inhumane.
John, you're the demographics guy, and I've heard you often talk about the crunch that we're going to face in the next 15 years. So there's no turning this back in terms of how we're going to fix it. And I'm not sure that this approach is the fix that we need, or it's certainly not even a short-term solution to a long-term problem.
Yeah, I made my first presentation on this at the Empire Club in 2012, and it basically said, look, the sidecar of polling is demographics, and demographics don't lie. You can see them in a straight line going up, and you know where this is going to go. I mean, it doesn't take a committee to decide whether this is going to have a big impact. By 2036, the entire healthcare system is going to sag massively. By about 2041, the pressure is going to be off the system because people like me will probably not be around. The issue that I find here is a little more arcane, and that has to do with the lawsuit itself. I listened to some of the arguments the other day, and one of them was, well, why are you just picking on elderly people? Why is it just them? You're putting them out to some other community. And to Keith's point, how do they get looked after? We have a crisis on our hands, not just in terms of affordable housing, but in terms of where you're going to put 20,000 people who are on a waiting list to go somewhere. This is going to become a very, very acute problem. And what I find is that a lot of these cases end up in court, and they do have outcomes, but they're years down the line, and maybe we can wait for that. somebody's going to make some decisions in a courtroom, much like the Supreme Court has on many other decisions, as to whose rights are going to be looked after and whose responsibility is to do these sort of things. What I would posit is that I think it's up to governments, instead of having, somebody who's a figurehead for seniors care, or a health minister that doesn't seem to be dealing with long-term care very much, is that there be some kind of a plan to deal with this. I don't want to be the process guy on this panel, but what I find about this government in particular is it just kind of goes, it's game. We're back to retail. You're bed blocking, out of here, and too bad, it's going to be 130 kilometers from where you are. That's not going to solve anything, because we have two problems. First is we don't have enough room for people to get in who've had a heart attack and need that bed, but we also don't have any space for these people to go. I think we're just on the verge of a massive crisis. Give it another 3 or 4 years, and people are going to be not just aging out, but they're going to have to be aging in somewhere. And I don't know who's going to bring, the shovel to put in the ground to help them get that kind of help.
I just want to get to the question around the homeless encampments, because that came up this week based on a conversation or a presentation that the Premier was making earlier about infrastructure, and was asked, what should we do at a municipal level, and kind of to the point around school boards. Everything is granular at that level, because the municipalities are the ones that bear the brunt and the cost and everything else of dealing with the encampments. And certainly we've had it here in Toronto, but you can go to any community across the country. I spent a good deal of time in Peterborough. You're seeing all of it in smaller communities where you didn't see it before. So he was on script in terms of saying, we're trying to deal with this at a municipal level. But then, he kind of just ripped the Band-Aid and said, actually told us what he was thinking.
Do you know what the best way to get people be able to get out of the encampments, get out of homeless? Get an application and drop it off one of these companies and start working. You need to start working if you're healthy. Bottom line, if you're unhealthy, I'll take care of you the rest of my life. Your life will take care of you. But if you're healthy, get off your A.S.S. and start working like everyone else is. Very simple.
And some applause there at the end of that. And I'll just say, I was talking to my mom yesterday, and I always know I'm being set up when Mom says, "So did you hear the Premier?" And she'll give the line, and she said, "I really want to know what you think about this." And she cited this comment, right? And I just a note to Premier Ford. I know you've got elected officials in your cabinet, but I also know you can appoint unelected officials to your cabinet. Mom would be a good front bencher for you. And I would say that whether it was Premier Wynne or Premier Ford, because Mom gets to the point. On the one hand, she agrees with the Premier, and it says, and she will cite a lot of anecdotal examples that she knows in her world of people who are just, fucking the dog, and they're going to sit around and not do anything, and they're going to take advantage of a system. And I think that's a legitimate argument to some degree. It's anecdotal. But at the same time, where we hear the Premier talk about, these people in the encampments can get a resume and go get a job at a construction company, I'm pretty sure they're not equipped to do that either. So we're really mixing up the issues here. On the other hand, my mom will say, but I'll be the first one to do the food drive, and I'll go and get the clothing drive, and I'll go and take care of the folks who need to be taken care of in the community. So somewhere in between there, Tim, we need to kind of look at these issues in a more of a realistic and a holistic way. I think I understand the sentiment from the Premier, but I think he did a disservice to the municipalities that are trying to cope with these issues, because it's not as simple as just saying, get a bloody job.
I hear it in a different way. I think when we see Premier Ford speak from the heart and on principle, I think that actually connects. Principle that the best way forward to any kind of security in life is for employment. So I actually think this does connect. Yeah, I've sparked a few people pushing the other direction, but I do. And the other thing I connect with this too, Dave, is that I do sense a growing impatience towards fear with encampments in our cities, not just the biggest cities, but in medium-sized cities as well. I think this issue is going to continue to build momentum. There'll be a greater demand to stop encampments, to clear them out. And I bet, like we're seeing in the election in British Columbia, this is then going to trip across that line of forced treatment of individuals. I think Ford is connecting on both those principles, and I think it resonates with a lot of people.
Yeah, and I don't disagree, Kathleen, that in fact there are people who are saying, listen, we can't have this, and there's an emotional, visceral reaction in my local neighborhood where I never had this before, and all of a sudden I'm seeing, tents in the ravine or whatever it may be. I get that. But at the same time, clearing out the encampment it's not solving the problem, similar to finding people who aren't moving on to a long-term care home. It is about poverty. It's about making sure that we raise people out of poverty. You and I have talked about this before. Poverty costs Ontario $30 billion, and that's a pre-pandemic number annually. So surely there's a way of finding, solutions with that money as opposed to it only being about get a bloody job. I think you're muted. There you go.
Yeah. There's so many layers to this issue. And, to Tim's point, I think the Premier, speaking from his heart, does connect with particularly his base. His oversimplification of complex issues is legend. And so this is another example of that. When we were in government, we were trying to find a different way of working on reducing poverty. The basic income pilot was demonstrating that if people had just a little bit more money, we saw people doing exactly what the Premier's talking about. We saw people going into the workforce because they had the clothes that they needed, because they could put their vehicle back on the road, because they could get the services that they needed. So I think that this is just such an oversimplification of the issue. I think it is him speaking from his heart in a way that demonstrates a real either ignorance of or lack of caring about what it means for people who have gotten to the point where they're living in a homeless encampment or they're living in their car. To that point, there are people who are using the food banks, who are living in their cars, who do have jobs. They already have jobs. And so what does that say about, the wage structure in our cities and in our province? So, I think that there are a whole bunch of solutions that this Premier has not been willing to look at. And it's easier to stand at a mic and blame people than it is to actually look at how we might support them. At the same time, he's shutting down safe consumption sites. So he's not using evidence to actually develop policies that are going to work to resolve the issues that he ostensibly is trying to resolve. So that for me is the frustration. If you want to shoot your mouth off at a mic, then tell me what your plan is to actually make that assertion that you are putting forward a reality.
Well, if I could, to Kathleen's point about the universal basic income, I watched your speech at St. Francis Xavier University this year, and you talked about how you had that pilot project going, the universal basic income, and then when you couldn't get any help from the federal government, but when COVID hit, boom, $2,000 checks for everybody.
Yeah.
Would that have not supplemented and really proven a universal basic income program can work and stop these encampments, stop this homeless trend in its tracks? As you say, for a lot of people, it's just a matter of getting back on their feet. That kind of income can give them enough room to either get a nanny for the kid or get, as you say, the clothes to go to work, whatever. Give them that breathing room. It seemed to be working. And as I recall, this Premier promised not to cancel the universal basic income in his 2018 election campaign, but went ahead and canceled it anyway.
Well, and it gets at the heart of the matter, John, I think, in terms of, getting it's such a big issue. We're back to the idea of too hard to get your arms around from that perspective. Having said that, I find it hard to believe that the Premier doesn't care about the people who are living in poverty or people who are living in the encampment. But if retail politics is your play, that isn't the playbook we need to solve these problems.
Well, maybe not. I had the privilege of working with Senator Hugh Segal, for 6.5 years, and I know all about the pilot program that he put in place, and that it was a good thing under the Liberals that it actually started. And it should have continued on because it really does do a job. But we're not just working with people who need jobs or need income. We're talking about people who also have mental health challenges and a series of other social challenges that even if they have that money would still require some kind of assistance. So again, we're back to this kind of issue of the elderly in our society and whether they're going to be bed blocking and whether they've got a place to go. Like, what do you do with this? What is the plan? It's a multi-layered plan because it deals with civic politics and all of the people there. For full disclosure, I was actually working for Hugh and then seconded for 3 months to be an executive assistant to a minister. I actually did a bit of a run before the government fell, and it wasn't my fault. But what I found myself doing more often than not was saying, what the minister really meant to say. And I think sometimes, this premier says some stuff and then backtracks a couple of days later. I think, if a phrase had been used, Tim, I don't know if you've ever heard this, but, it's better to give them a hand up as opposed to a handout.
Sure.
It might have, had a little bit of a difference. So instead of talking about the real issue here, we're talking about the semantics of it. And I just think it's a very complex issue requiring more than just income.
Right. We're going to leave it there. And we want to thank all y'all for sitting in. And Kathleen Wynne, Tim Hudak, it's been great to have you. We hope you'll come back. The seats are there for you, so we'll keep you in the calendar. And
we're gonna Premier and I are gonna unionize, and we'll come back to you with our plan.
Very good.
We're gonna play hard to get.
Exactly. Kathleen Wynne, Tim Hudak, John Wright, Keith Leslie. Yes, this is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. If you've got questions or ideas about the show, by all means, you can connect with me on the socials at Dave Trafford. Finds me on X, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. Yes, I'm on Threads from time to time. Still haven't figured out the usefulness of that. And what we'll do is we'll add an X poll to this show. Should we be digging a tunnel under the 401? And we're curious to see what you have to say. All right. Thanks for joining us. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast for Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.